I'm in a crappy band with some high school buddies. A few weeks ago, our bassist, Pierce, informed the rest of the band that his parents had flown to Europe and left their house for us in Fort Collins. His dad is a sound engineer and has a recording studio in the house. We were ecstatic. So we packed light and made the drive from California to Fort Collins, ready to track a backlog of 8 songs we'd been sitting on. It was mid-spring, and the mountains looked like they were jutting from oceans of blue and yellow wildflowers. The drive was long, but it was nothing short of spectacular. In fact, it was so beautiful that one night, after a recording session, Pierce suggested we go camping. I laughed at the idea. They all knew I'd had a somewhat negative experience in the Colorado Rockies a few years ago, but Ronnie and Jeff jumped on board and insisted I not be a wet blanket about it. Pierce recommended some vanilla tent camping at the foot of the mountain, but Ronnie had a bright idea. He wanted to do some astrophotography, and for that, he said, "We need to go to a place that's really dark." So he spent some time Googling and discovering Comanche Peak Wilderness, a remote section of a popular national park. "What a great idea," I remember chirping. "Why, surely nothing could go wrong." Of course, things did go wrong, and it started on the drive up there. People always forget that evening begins at around 3 p.m. in the deep woods. As soon as the sun dips behind the treetops, the gloom sets in, and things get eerie. Nothing makes me more claustrophobic than the sight of that heavy murk sliding over the world. My body rejects it because my brain knows it's too early for dark. I was on edge the second the paved road gave way to dirt. The other thing people forget is how loud the woods are at times, and how silent they can become at others. The contrast between them can make your head spin. One moment it's a symphony of owls and crickets and toads. Then a branch will snap or thunder will crack, and suddenly you're wondering if you've gone deaf. And then, of course, if you think about it too much, you realize just how full the darkness is, with all those watchful eyes. We went in as deep as we could. We ditched Pierce's truck on the side of some forgotten road and hiked about a half-mile into the trees. There was no trail. We followed the GPS to a tiny lake nestled somewhere uphill, where Ronnie could set up his camera and get a clear view of the sky. We hadn't crossed a solitary soul after entering the preserve a few hours prior, and I felt apprehensive about the fact that no one knew where we were. By dusk, we'd set up the 2 tents Pierce had borrowed from his parents. We made a small bonfire pit between them and strung all our food up in the trees, like you're supposed to do. Ronnie set up his camera along the shore, and then we waited for nightfall. My anxiety worsened as darkness ate away at the sky. The guys didn't notice. They drank and smoked and carried on, and right when the world went black, leaves began to crunch in the distance behind our tents. A girl emerged from the tree line and stopped at the edge of our little clearing. The girl was probably 8 years old and wore a white dressing gown, like she'd just woken up. She had platinum blonde, almost white hair, and skin so pale she looked like a ghost in the firelight. She wasn't carrying a flashlight or anything. She'd been walking in pitch black woods. She squinted at our fire as if it annoyed her and let out a few wet coughs. We all just stared at each other in confusion while she studied us. There were no roads or trails in the area. This was not a campground. Her presence made no sense. Jeff eventually called out to her, asking if she was okay, and she replied, "My mom's sick. Can you guys come help us?" Where is she?" Jeff asked. The girl just pointed into the forest. The trees and shadows and mist clustered together to form a great big wall of nope. I gave Jeff a subtle, "hell no" headshake. I might be a coward, but I'm not about to get disappeared by some malevolent wood pixie. Ronnie stood up and asked the girl if they were camping or if they had a house or what. The girl just said, "She's really sick. Just follow me." She started coughing again. At this point, all four of us could sense that something was wrong. Pierce, probably the cleverest of us, invited the girl to come warm up by the fire and explain what was going on. I think he knew she'd decline. The girl just turned and walked back into the woods, coughing as she went. Before she vanished, she turned around and said something, but we couldn't be certain of what. I heard, "So you'll be a liar," but Ronnie heard, "Soon you'll meet the liar." We built the fire up a lot more, mostly to keep a good perimeter against the darkness. All of us were creeped out, but after a few hours, the guys had mostly forgotten about the girl. They laughed and told stories about drunken escapades. At some point, Jeff and I went to the tree line to take a whiz. I walked about 10 steps into the woods and blasted the darkness with my flashlight, Jeff following closely behind. I wanted to see if there was a clearing on the other side, or a footpath the girl might have followed. But there was nothing, just a snarl of impassable trees. We heard Ronnie shouting something, so we jogged back to the fire and saw him examining the southern edge of the clearing. That was the direction we'd left the truck in. Pierce said as we passed by, "He thinks he heard more footsteps." I heard them too. Standing next to Ronnie, I could make out a new pair of feet trampling the leaves in the dark. It was louder than the girl had been, probably bigger. "Show yourself," Ronnie shouted again. "We're armed." To my surprise, a woman answered him. She laughed and said, "Don't shoot, just a hiker." We moved back and watched her step into the clearing. She was probably in her late 30s and wore a raggedy hat and an old, beat-up pack. I remember hearing Pierce grumble something like, "Real private spot you found here, Ronnie." And I agreed. How the hell were all these people bumping into us way out here? The woman introduced herself as Sarah and apologized for scaring us. Ronnie demanded to know what she was doing out here, and she explained that she'd done the full-day loop around the mountain, but got lost for a while. She claimed to have found her bearings and now knew where she was going. "You know the way back?" he repeated to her. "Yep." "In the dark, without a flashlight?" "Uh-huh. I know this area pretty well." Ronnie wasn't buying a word of it. He turned back to the rest of us and said, "We're getting cased, you guys. We're about to get robbed soon as we fall asleep. Campers get killed by thieves and meth heads all the time." "Well, thanks for bringing us out here, dingus," Jeff said. Sarah laughed again. She was real smiley for a woman lost in the woods, in the dark. "I swear, it's nothing like that," she said. "Look, I'll be on my way." For whatever reason, I felt the urge to press her further. So I said, "You know, you're not the only person we've met out here who's walking around without a light." That fake little smile fell off Sarah's face, and it took the wind right out of my sails. She stared at me like she could see down to the deepest places inside me. "You met a little girl?" she asked with a blank expression. My bandmates all exchanged looks of incredulity. Sarah collected herself, and a new smile spread across her face. She said, "Don't listen to anything that little brat says. She's a liar through and through. Look, why don't you guys hike down to the ranger station with me? It'll be safer together." She pointed behind herself into the woods. Something lit up in my brain. This was the second time a stranger had tried to coax us into the dark. We weren't about to get robbed. Something much worse was about to happen. Pierce seemed to have come to the same conclusion, and he invited Sarah to instead join us around the fire. As he did with the little girl, he knew Sarah would decline. The strange woman told us she had to get back before it got any colder, and with that, she turned around and hurried into the woods. After a long debate about what to do, we decided that hiking back to the truck was the fastest way to get lost or killed. We hadn't used the trail, and our phone batteries were low. Every time the wind blew, it set 1,000 trees groaning and shivering, which made it impossible to orient ourselves by sound. It was so black that if I stared into the darkness long enough, I started having minor hallucinations as my brain tried to make sense of the void. So, we kept the fire blazing and agreed to sleep in two-person shifts. Since Pierce and I were the soberest of the bunch, we agreed to stay up first. But only an hour into our watch, we started hearing the coughs and sputters of a little girl in the distance. I followed Pierce to the lake's edge, which lay about 30 yards from our camp. There, we heard an eerie voice wafting on the breeze. I saw the silhouette of a person milling about near the water a few 100 feet away, and realized it was the girl. She was wandering around in the dark, singing. We booked it back to the fire and woke up Jeff and Ronnie, alerting them to the girl's presence. But as we discussed what to do, another voice erupted from nearby and began singing as well. It sounded just like Sarah. Pierce and I jumped into the tent with the other guys and sealed it up, terrified that the time had come for whatever these creeps had planned. But no one approached our camp. The two people just walked in slow half circles behind the trees, singing together in a language I couldn't identify. Ronnie always keeps a menacing-looking trail knife on him when he goes hiking, and he scrambled for it while shouting that he'd butcher anybody who came near us. His yelling caused the people outside to go quiet for a few moments. I pulled out my phone to record some of the voices, but my hands were shaking so hard I could barely operate it. I caught a bit of the girl, but then something even weirder happened. None of us were certain of how many people were in those woods, but we heard a third voice at that moment. It was deeper and guttural, like the sound of some night predator stalking around in a jungle. I'm not certain the noise was made by a person. Ronnie and Jeff believe the sound is coming from the girl, who has a coughing fit and then begins channeling some demonic voice. Pierce and I think it's a third person or an animal that was with them, waiting for us to leave the safety of the bonfire. After the commotion, the activity in the woods died down for a while. The guys and I remained inside the tent, terrified, only leaving its shelter to throw more wood on the fire about once an hour. None of us slept, and for the rest of the night, we occasionally heard distant singing, laughing, coughing, and the occasional whisper. Sometimes the girl would say, "Can you help us?" in the exact same tone as if a voice had been recorded and replayed over and over. We also heard someone, probably Sarah, climbing a nearby tree and shouting things like, "I see you, boys," and "Let's go together. It's safe now." And that was it. By dawn, we were exhausted from terror and half frozen in the tent. The noises stopped, and the people, if there were people at all, had long abandoned their efforts to lure us into the dark. We packed up and hiked back to the truck, which had thankfully not been ransacked. As far as I'm concerned, the next time I go camping, it'll be in a treeless desert in Arizona. I have worked as a paranormal investigator for close to 30 years. I always believed that there was more to our world than what most think. Like the submerged section of an iceberg, there is something under our choppy waters of regular existence. I suppose there is little other reason to take this job other than that belief. It certainly isn't for the money or respect. But I would be lying if I said my early years in this profession didn't test my faith in the existence of the paranormal world. For the first 4 years of my work, I found nothing. No evidence of a single paranormal phenomenon in any of the cases I took. There were hordes of unconfirmable ghost sightings, hauntings that were explained away by natural phenomenon, and even the odd prankster or two. I felt like I was floundering. I started to wonder if I had followed a road that led nowhere. My destination nothing but a hazy mirage perpetually on the horizon. That was, until I took a case in 1997. My most haunting case, still to this day. The case of the grinning man. "Do you mind if I record this interview?" I asked. "No, that's okay," Audrey said. We were in the living room of a small home. Audrey sat on the sofa across from me, a 35-year-old woman that looked closer to 50. She was small, hunched over, as if a weight pressed on her shoulders. I placed the tape recorder on the coffee table and pressed the record button. Inside, the cassette tape whirred to life. "Audrey, thank you for calling me to investigate your problem. I want you to know I'll take your claims seriously and investigate them as such. Whatever the outcome may be, if the phenomenon you're experiencing is paranormal or natural, I'll seek to find the truth the best I can." "Thank you. Please, start from the beginning." She sighed and brushed some stray, frazzled hair behind her ear with one hand. I could see she was at her wit's end. Her face bore deep wrinkles beyond her age. Her eyes contained within dark purple sockets, and her nails chewed away to ragged edges. Whatever she was experiencing, paranormal or not, was certainly real to her. "Okay," she began. "I guess it all started when I was a baby." "That far back?" "Yes. My first memories are of seeing him." "Him?" "What I call the grinning man." She shuddered when she said it. "The thing that's been haunting me my entire life. I can even remember him as a baby. It's burned into my memories. He dresses like someone from the 40s or 50s, with a tan trench coat and black fedora. I was laying in my crib when I first recall seeing him. He gripped the crib's bars while he peered down at me through them, looming over a little, helpless me like an ominous mountain. Just thinking of it turns my stomach." "And was he grinning at you?" "Yes, like he always is." "Have you ever heard people describe a psychopath's grin, where their smile is there and looks friendly enough, but if you look closely, you can see their eyes hold nothing?" I think I understand. His smile is like that. It's like he has reptilian eyes, unfeeling, cold, predatory, evil. Must have had quite an impact on you, considering you remember it from that far back. Has it been cropping up your entire life? Yes, it's sporadic. Sometimes I go years without seeing him. Other times, I'll see him multiple times a month. And what's a typical encounter like? Well, he'll appear out of nowhere. Then he stands as still as a statue and watches me with that sick grin of his plastered across his face. He could show up anywhere, at any time. Among the trees as I walk through the park, from a random house's window as I walk down the street. The shadows of my own home when I get a glass of water in the middle of the night. Does this entity ever say or do anything? No, always silent, always unmoving, just tracking me with his eyes. Interesting. Do you ever feel anything when you see this entity? Yes, an intense sense of dread and a tightness in the chest, almost like he's reaching out with imaginary, brooding fingers to squeeze my heart. And sometimes, when I see him, something terrible happens soon after. You mean that a sighting of the grinning man is a precursor to a traumatic event? Yes, not all the time, but enough that when I see him, my nerves will be shot, and I'll walk around with this dark cloud weighing on me as I wait for the worst to happen. Could you give me an example? Audrey sighed, and tears welled at the corner of her eyes. She averted a gaze and looked out the window. If it's too difficult, you don't have to. No, it's okay. She reached for the tissue box on the coffee table, took a couple, sniffled, and dabbed her eyes. The worst incident was in 1993. I had been married for 3 years and had just given birth to our first child. He was 4 months old at the time. I was back at work by then, and I was coming home very late one evening. The roads were dead. A bad storm had just passed through, and I still remember the long, colourful glows of the traffic lights and street lamps across the wet roads. I came to a stop at a red. I just happened to glance to my right. He was there, half covered in shadows. He stood on the pavement by the crosswalk, the walk signal glowing green as if he meant to cross it. That grin had sunk my heart, as if it had turned into stone. I don't know exactly how long I stayed there, locked in his gaze, but when my light turned green again, I got out of there as fast as I could. When I looked in the rear view, I saw his silhouette in the street, watching me as I fled. I knew I'd struggled to sleep that night. I was shaking and felt like throwing up. I had to take a Valium, and that helped. I popped into bed and passed out more than fell asleep. I was awoken by my husband frantically shaking me in the morning. His face was pale, a look of sheer, terror-filled panic I had never seen before. Our son had passed away in the night. The death was ruled as a SIDS case. I sat in silence, giving Audrey a moment as she let her emotions out. At the time, I wasn't sure what to think. Her story was unique, far from the standard ghostly apparitions others saw. I was intrigued. I did wonder if it was a mental condition. I had encountered a schizophrenic who would believe their hallucinations were a result of paranormal phenomena on a previous case, though their condition had been more apparent, even to me. If Audrey was ill, it was not obvious. Audrey, have you seen any medical professionals? It is possible that your sightings could be hallucinations. Yes, I have. I had kept the grinning man a secret my entire life. After all, who would believe me? I even kept it from my husband. But after our son had died, I had to tell him. I don't know why, but I just did. He was obviously concerned for me, my mental health. He wanted me to see a therapist. I refused at first. We had a lot of fights about it, and eventually he forced me to go see someone. What did they say? Well, I was put through the ringer. Eventually, I was diagnosed with psychosis. I was put on meds, went to therapy twice a week, and none of it helped. He would still show up. Eventually, I quit the meds, quit the therapy. Waste of time and money, as far as I was concerned. But my husband thought different. He didn't like that I quit all of it, and our marriage kind of fell apart from there. But I still am, convinced what I was experiencing is real. That's why I came to you. I figured someone like you would at least take my story seriously. I nodded. I do. And there's another reason I sought you out. Please. Well, I need help. I've been seeing the Grinning Man a lot more lately. He's been appearing more frequently than ever before. How often? Every few nights for the past 2 or 3 months. He only shows up at night now, usually outside my bedroom window. And I did see him in the hallway last week. I never used to sleep with my bedroom door closed, but now I do. I don't know if I can take it much longer. My nerves are shot. Dread suffocates my chest all the time. I think something terrible is going to happen soon. I'm scared of what he might do to me. But you can prove it, right? You can prove he's real. You can help me get rid of it, right? I'll try, Audrey. I'll try. After the interview, I tested a home for electromagnetic fields. Strong EMFs can often be responsible for hallucinations of apparitions, or that creepy feeling that elicits goosebumps on the back of your neck. It often causes people to believe they're experiencing a haunting. In reality, it's usually just poor electrical wiring, or old and dirty wall sockets bleeding electricity into the environment. Those EMFs can mess with people's senses. Though Audrey's sightings of the Grinning Man are not tied to a particular location, I figured EMFs may be responsible for her lasting string of sightings that occurred primarily in a bedroom. But after a sweep of the house, I detected nothing abnormal. I then set up a camera on a tripod in her bedroom. It sat beside the head of the bed and had a complete shot of her room, including the window on the opposite wall and the door on the right that led into the hallway. Both places she had seen the Grinning Man previously. I showed her how to record and instructed her to do so when she went to bed. I also gave her a nightlight to plug into an outlet so the camera could see. Night vision and thermal imaging cameras were well out of my budget back then. I swung by her house the next 2 mornings to collect and review the tapes. Those nights were uneventful. On the 3rd night, I got a frenzied call from Audrey. The ringing jarred me awake. The clock on my nightstand read 2:08 a.m. I trudged to the phone, and as soon as I answered, Audrey's frantic voice came over the line. "He was here. He tried to hurt me." I arrived at Audrey's a little over half an hour later. She paced back and forth in the living room, a neglected cigarette burning in her hand, the ash tip grown long and pale as bone. She muttered one thing over and over. "No escape, no escape, no escape." It took a minute to calm her down. At first, she looked right through me, as if I weren't there. Her eyes distant and fear-stricken, as she continued to mutter, "Can't escape," until the words burned into my ears. I eventually ushered her into the kitchen and sat her down. I found some cocoa in the cupboards and made her a warm cup. It seemed to help a little. Her trembling stopped. "I'm going to watch the tape," I said. "Do you want to watch it with me?" She shook her head adamantly. She waited in the kitchen while I watched. She had a VCR player hooked up to a CRT television in her living room. I sat on the edge of the coffee table, rather than the sofa, for a closer view. I inserted the tape, and the TV came to life with a view of Audrey's home bathed in dim orange from the nightlight, and the window at the far end shined with a pale glow from the moon. The footage wasn't great, being comparatively rudimentary for what we have today. The picture quality was grainy, and sometimes wavered in the way those VCR tapes did, but it was enough to see what I needed to. I fast-forwarded the tape until the text on the bottom right corner read 1:30 a.m. I sat with a pen and notepad in hand, and I still have my notes from what I saw on the tape. 1:30 a.m. Audrey asleep in bed. Nothing untoward. 1:35 a.m. Audrey becomes visibly restless, flipping and turning violently and asleep. 1:38 a.m. Audrey settled. 1:40 a.m. Dark figure across the window on opposite wall. 1:42 a.m. Dark figure cross window again in opposite direction. 1:44 a.m. Dark figure standing in front of window. Figure looks like a person, possibly wearing a hat. Figure too dark to make out features. 1:46 a.m. Static, intermittently breaking up picture. Figure still standing at window. 1:50 a.m. The figure disappeared. Did not walk or move away. Simply vanished. 1:51 a.m. Audrey becoming restless again. 1:52 a.m. Bedroom door opened. That was the last note I took. My heart was pounding in my ears by this point. A few seconds after, the door had opened, seemingly by itself. The man appeared from the darkness in the hallway, like a demon emerging from the depths of hell. I dropped my notepad and gawked at the television screen. Even through the grainy footage and the worsening bursts of static, I could make out the grin plastered across the figure's face. The grinning man. The nightlights suddenly went out, and the screen went black. It took a few moments for the lens to adjust to the dimmer moonlight coming through the window, and when it did, the grinning man was a dark silhouette just inside the doorway. I stood and approached the television, bent over at the waist, face inches from the screen to get a closer look. The tape wavered badly, making everything unrecognizable. When the picture cleared, the grinning man had teleported from the doorway to the bedside, just in front of the camera. He peered down at Audrey. My heartbeat thumped steadily in my ears. The picture wavered again, for longer. When it steadied, the grinning man had his arms extended downward, towards Audrey. She was now kicking and thrashing in bed. The grinning man's hands appeared to be clasped around her throat. The blanket was flung from the bed suddenly, a big dark cloud moving across the screen. Audrey thrashed, and the grinning man held on. The moonlight glanced off his teeth, making that diabolic grin a glimmering silver blemish at the base of his darkened face. Like his grin, his eyes shined palely with manic glee. A prolonged burst of static. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. The picture came back. The nightlight was on, and Audrey sat upright in bed grasping at her neck. The grinning man was gone. I felt something in the air then, like heavy humidity, a powerful feeling that pervaded the house, a feeling of anger. The VCR tape paused by itself, then began to rewind. The tape whined frantically inside the player with a high pitch. The picture on the screen sheared, then went black. Smoke seeped from the vents of the player and around the edges of the opening flap. I mashed the eject button, hoping to save the tape, but the crinkling noise that sounded like crumbling cellophane left me with little confidence. The flap turned back, and the tape flew out as if shot from a cannon. The mess of cracked casing and wadded, tangled tape hit me in the chest and fell to the floor. The television flew off the cabinet suddenly, pushed from an unseen force, and landed before my feet with the screen shattering. Audrey came in from the kitchen, alarmed. She glanced at the TV, laying busted on the floor, then the tape next to me, and then at me. "What happened?" "He's real," I said, breathlessly. "I saw it on the tape. He's real." Perhaps it was foolish to simply believe leaving the home would have helped, but it was the only thing I could think to do. I took Audrey to a nearby hotel and booked us into neighbouring rooms. I sat on the edge of my bed, at a loss. I had completely underestimated what we were dealing with. Until watching that tape, I wasn't even sure the entity was real. But not only was it real, it was dangerous. I phoned a close acquaintance, one that wasn't so happy to be woken at 3 in the morning, who worked for another paranormal investigation team. He was happy to help once I explained the seriousness of the situation. He gave me the number of a good medium who could help give me a reading, perhaps to identify what we were dealing with. I was also hoping she might have known methods to banish the entity from Audrey's life, if it were at all possible. I decided to call the medium first thing in the morning, but it would be too late for her to do anything by then. I lay down on the bed, my thoughts swimming in a fuzzy haze of fatigue and the come down of an adrenaline spike. I realized that, for the first time, with true conviction, I had encountered something under the surface of the normal world. Something sinister hiding in those deep and dark, murky waters below. You can live your life pretending that world is not real. Many do. And sure, chances are you'll never be affected by it. But you should know, that world is real. And it's there, lurking in the darkest shadows around us. With some difficulty, I eventually fell asleep. The short doze from 3 to dawn was restless. I had a nightmare I was drowning in black sludge, as dark as the starless night sky above me. My arms and legs struggled through thick and oily liquid as I fought to keep my head above the surface. My breath cut short, and my chest squeezed tight. Panic flooded in through every pore of my body as the presence of an evil prickled my skin. And then, darkness. I awoke to sunlight glowing around the edges of the grimy motel curtain. The bedsheets were a scrunched up mess, and my blanket lay strewn over the floor. With a sick feeling creeping up my gut, I realized how this scene closely mirrored what I saw in the aftermath of the attack on Audrey. I rushed out of my room to Audrey's next door. She didn't answer the first few knocks, so I knocked louder. No answer. I called her name and pounded on the door. Still no answer. I rushed to the motel's front desk, convincing them to let me into the room. When we entered, Audrey was in her bed. Her pale face poked out from the blanket. Her lips were blue. Her eyes vacant and lifeless, stared at nothing. My heart plummeted. She was dead. I dream of that morning often. The moment we walked into that godforsaken room to see Audrey drained of life. I'll never forget that. The case has stuck with me all these years. I pored over the details many times. I relive my actions and question if there was more I could have done. I try not to blame myself. I know it's not healthy. But I just can't lift the weight of guilt that still sits on my shoulders. Or perhaps it's my liver that takes the brunt. Fact is, as I see it, she came to me for help, and I did not do enough. I wish I could tell you I got revenge on this thing, but I tracked the entity down and vanquished it like a hero at the end of a Hollywood action movie. But life doesn't tend to work like that. Besides my experience with Audrey and that close brush I had that night in the dingy motel room, I've yet to cross the path of the grinning man ever again. But that's the nature of this line of work. Things don't get wrapped up and topped off with a neatly tied bow. We deal with things that are on the edge, things that straddle the line between the world we know and the one we don't. Things are hazy, transient, and often unknowable. Neat resolutions don't find their way to us easily. I can tell you that Audrey's death was eventually ruled as a case of sudden arithmetic death syndrome, or SADS. As you can probably guess, I have some doubts that that was all there was to it. I still call the medium. We met a couple of weeks after Audrey's passing. We went to the motel and booked the same room Audrey had died in. The work of the desk was certainly curious as to why I insisted on that room, but I refused to say. The medium's face drained of colour the second she stepped inside. She walked around the room in silence for 10 minutes. She moved slowly, intently, closing her eyes and breathing deep as she tapped into a strange, ominous world. Can't say I envy her talents. Something incredibly powerful, she eventually said. It's not here now, but I can still feel its vestiges. How long ago did this happen? A little over 2 weeks. A grave expression crossed the medium's face. Yes, very powerful. Do you know what the entity is? Not precisely, but I can say that its soul is black and twisted. That thing has a soul? All intelligent forces do. And what do you mean by black and twisted? I mean, the entity is a corrupted agent of death itself. I was speechless for a moment, as the weight of her words robbed me of breath. A drip coming from the sink in the bathroom was the only thing to break the crushing silence. What can we do about it? I asked. The medium smiled wistfully. At my naivete, I assume. I was young and inexperienced and ready for a fight. She knew that. Then her expression grew dark as she took one last look over the room. Not a thing, she said.